Thanks, Subir. Should I speak from here?
Yes, maybe from there because
Okay.
it will be
Thanks, Subir. I think we all middle grounders here, and you've set the rules that we are here to find the middle ground. So I take it that we are all here because we are interested both in accelerating the growth process, but we're also interested in that acceleration taking place in a sustainable framework. But I just want to step back for a couple of minutes and ask the question, why the middle ground? Because there is also a very large constituency in this country, a very influential constituency, which would argue that the middle ground is a luxury that we can ill afford at this stage. With 10 million jobs to create every year, with a huge backlog of poverty and backwardness to eradicate, why even bother about a middle ground for the next 15, 20 years? Just, go full steam ahead and start worrying about the middle ground sometime later. And this view cuts across the political spectrum. It dominates the intellectual discourse. It dominates the English language press. It dominates the pink press, certainly. And it's a view that cannot be ignored and has to be taken into account. So I just want to spend just a few minutes, very few minutes on addressing this issue. Why, in fact, do we need to search the middle ground? I would say that there are pressing reasons why India needs to pause a little and ask itself the question that we are asking today is, how do we search for the middle ground? The first and most important reason is the demographic reason. We are 1.25 billion today. Our karma is going to be 1.7 billion by the year 2050. We are going to increase our population even after 2050, even after our total fertility rates have fallen to 2.1 or thereabouts by the middle of the next decade. And this would be at a time when most large countries are actually going to be seeing either population plateaus or population declines. China, for example, the only other country that can be compared to us demographically, is actually going to start seeing the demographic decline from 2040 onwards. So the fact that we're going to add 1/3 of our population in the next 30 years is a staggering prospect and should inform the choice of the growth trajectory that we are going to choose. So the demographic imperative, I think, is fundamental to whatever we discuss. The climate change imperative is now increasingly becoming apparent, and it is manifested in different ways. It's manifested in the unpredictability of the monsoon. The total volume of the monsoon has not changed in the last 100 years, but the time distribution has certainly changed. The unpredictability in terms of the frequency of extreme monsoon failures or excess monsoon days has certainly increased in the last 15 to 20 years. And whatever you say, even if agriculture accounts for less than 15% of GDP, rural prosperity and increasingly a large part of industrial consumption also is determined by rural prosperity. And the best index of that today is to really look at what is happening to motorcycle sales. So the monsoon unpredictability, the complete now scientific consensus that exists on the increase in the mean sea levels, which is the most incontrovertible part of the climate change argument, and the fact that you have a 7,500 kilometer long coastline, 9 states, almost 150 to 200 million people living in the hazard areas, vulnerable to the increase in mean sea levels. Third, the overwhelming evidence that now exists on the retreat of the glaciers, barring an exception here or there. The fact of the matter is that all glaciers in the Himalayan ecosystem are under retreat, and what this does to the water supply, particularly in the North India, is up for debate. And fourthly, the state of our forests and what will happen to our forests particularly if India were to embark on an aggressive policy of exploiting its coal, iron ore, and bauxite reserves, because the new coal reserves, as the former chairman of Coal India and I tangled with this for 2 years, the new coal reserves, the new iron ore reserves, the new bauxite reserves are all in rich forest areas. And you're going to have a double whammy. You're going to not only deforest, but you're also going to contribute to global warming, because the forests are a very valuable carbon sink. And finally, you have the public health argument that today you have wealth of evidence suggesting that environment, pollution, contamination is extracting a cost in terms of increased morbidity and mortality. No, mortality not yet clearly established, but morbidity certainly very clearly established. So the second argument is climate change. The third argument, as I have mentioned to you, is the fact that public health indicators across the country are now increasingly being linked with environmental factors, whether those environmental factors emanate from air pollution, or whether those environmental factors emanate from water pollution, or whether they emanate from chemical contamination. You have now accumulating evidence to suggest that there is a public health cost that is being imposed, particularly on vulnerable sections of our society, who have to depend on private healthcare providers, and therefore healthcare really is now becoming one of the main contributory factors to the increase in rural indebtedness. And fourthly, there is the livelihood argument that it's not just middle-class lifestyles that we are talking about, but we are talking about basic livelihoods, which is access to forests for fuel wood, fodder, and small timber, protection of water resources, which are important for water security for local communities, or even the protection of other natural resources, as the case may be. So the why middle ground argument really rests on this four: the demographics, the climate change, the public health, and the livelihood. Now, if we are agreed that we must search for the middle ground, the next question really is, how do you search for the middle ground? My submission is that there is no template for a middle ground. The middle ground is necessarily going to depend on specific circumstances, and there is no magic formula that can be laid down for the search of the middle ground, which not only meets your growth objectives but also ensures environmental integrity. But one thing is clear to me, that the search for a middle ground with environmental deregulation is simply incompatible with each other. I think what you need is a regulatory framework to ensure that this middle ground gets internalized. The search for the middle ground gets internalized by economic agents. And how those regulations get enforced through a mix of market instruments, or through a mix of fiscal levies, or through the imposition of straightforward old command and control type of instruments, is something that we can discuss. But the notion that environmental regulations can be dispensed with altogether or lightened completely in order to ensure a faster growth process, in my view, is unrealistic. And that really should inform much of the public debate in the weeks and months to come. So the answer to the question, how do you search for the middle ground, depends on the specific circumstances of what we are talking about. We can come up with certain rules for the search of the middle ground. Partho and I tried to come up with those rules, but the rules that came up was not to the satisfaction of Coal India. And in fact, he is the author of Go, No Go. People accuse me of being villain of the Go, No Go controversy. He here is the author. And I think it's a very good philosophy. But why can't we know before we mine which area is a no-go, which area is a go? And that's how this whole debate started. Unfortunately, the results of the exercise came out quite different. 70% of the coal fields were go, 30% was no-go, and that was not to the satisfaction of the government that I functioned in. And finally, that 70-30 became 90-10. And now it's becoming 95-5 or thereabouts. So that's an example, by the way. That's an example of how to search for the middle ground, to establish a clear set of rules, to establish a certain system for delineation of areas, and then giving the freedom to the economic agents to carry out their activities. So that's one example. The example that you have taken, Shubir, BT Brinjal, is another example of how to create this middle ground. That here was the first time that a food crop, a transgenic was being introduced, food crop, not essential for food security. Nobody in his right senses would argue that Bengan Bharta is essential for food security or for nutritional security. But here was a first time a genetically modified transgenic crop was being introduced, and it was being introduced, hi Martin, it was being introduced in an environment where there was absolutely no scientific consensus and no political consensus. And therefore that suggests a second rule, a rule setting that, you know, what you need is in some of these areas where there are risks and where there are threats, at least you must be able to create a robust consensus amongst the scientific community and amongst the political community, the political stakeholders, in favor of the change that is being introduced. Unfortunately, in the case of the transgenics, we neither had a scientific consensus, nor did we have a political consensus. And that's why the approach that I adopted was not the American approach, which was the permissive approach, not the European approach, which was the prohibitive approach, but a peculiarly Indian middle ground approach of a precautionary approach. That, you know, let's hasten slowly on this. And that's why in the case of BT Brinjal, it's not a ban, it was a moratorium. And a moratorium was a fixed moratorium for 5 years, and within that 5 years, the idea was that you create a regulatory structure to govern the use of genetically modified crops. It didn't happen for a variety of reasons, but that's the second way of searching for the middle ground. So, you know, the National Green Tribunal you have alluded to, that suggests a third way of looking for the middle ground, which is to create institutions at an arm's length relationship from the government, and institutions that can enforce the environmental regulations without fear or favor. The National Green Tribunal was one effort to declog the judicial system, so to speak, and to create a specialized environmental court, because environmental issues are no longer straightforward issues. They involve issues of science, they involve issues of economics, they involve issues of sociology, food habits, as in the case of genetically modified crops. So you create a new set of institutions, and the National Green Tribunal was one such institution, and one other institution which I tried, which I did not succeed, was to create an independent regulator at an arm's length relationship from the ministry, who would then be responsible for monitoring and appraisal, not only appraisal, but also monitoring. Because in India, the real issue is not so much the clearances as much as the enforcement. The enforcement issues are far more important here because we have laws, we have rules, we have regulations, we have standards. What we lack is a transparent system of enforcement which sends the right signals that these are here to be implemented and not just to adorn the statute books. So this is a third way of searching for the middle ground, which is the design of new institutions, judicial institutions. You need judicial institutions or other institutions in a quasi-governmental framework which will take over the functions that the ministries are engaged in today and enforce the rules and regulations and standards that Parliament has passed. So I think I'll stop here. The need for a middle ground, to me at least, is well established. The way the debate really should take place is how do you ensure that the middle ground is as transparent and as rule-based and as non-discretionary as possible, but fully recognizing that in some cases you will require a command and control approach because of the very nature of the issues that we are dealing with. I'll just end by saying that I think the debate now, unfortunately, has become the way you have framed it, Subir, which you cautioned us against. But unfortunately, that's what the debate has become. It's environment versus development, growth versus regulation. I think that's the wrong framing of the debate. And I think we should go back to framing the issue the way you framed it, which is that given a certain growth trajectory that India needs for a variety of reasons, what is the best way of meeting this trajectory, growth objectives, without necessarily sacrificing its environmental objectives? In that, the issue that you have raised, measurement, is very, very important. I got a group under Partha Dasgupta's chairmanship. Pranab has just left. Pranab was a member of that group. And the idea was that by 2015, India would be the world leader in green accounting. That we would have not only the normal GDP, here is back. Pranab, no, I was just mentioning that we started this exercise with Partha Dasgupta and Pranab to give India a leadership role in the measurement of green growth. I think they came out with the analytical framework, the intellectual edifice. Nothing happened after that. I don't know whether government going on. Okay, maybe you can talk about it. But there was a great fear amongst my colleagues that as it is growth नीचे जा रहा है और GDP के green डालोगे तो और भी नीचे दिखाई देगा. This was the argument that was being given. Why are you, as it is, we have come down from 9 to 7, and if you're going to start reporting green growth, then we'll come down to 5. But the idea was that we should measure not only the environmental costs, but you might be ending up measuring environmental benefits also, in terms of reforestation, in terms of biodiversity conservation. So it's not just only environmental costs, there's also benefits that can be factored in. So I think the measurement issue is going to be very crucial. And that is going to be central to setting the debate, because then the country has some view, some perspective on what is happening to nature, what's happening to natural resources, what's happening to the measurement of environmental costs and environmental benefits. And I'm hopeful that sooner rather than later that path will be taken. So I'm delighted to Vikram and Subir for giving us this opportunity. So many experts here. The panel also very distinguished. And I just want to, I'm not making a commercial for the book, but what I try to do in the book is really address some of these issues and how in the 25 months or 26 months I had responsibility at the ministerial level, how I tried to resolve these issues. I ended up pleasing no constituency. The growth constituency was very happy to see me go. The environmental constituency, was lukewarm because I didn't do much for them either. And that's the danger of the middle ground, by the way. The danger of the middle ground is that you please neither side, as Martin Indyk would no doubt testify through his latest assignment. But I think we have to be in the middle ground. And that middle ground, gradually the space for the middle ground has to expand. Right now, I think the space for the middle ground is actually contracting. Thank you.
So I just want to, highlight a few issues that you raised. I think in this very, very important framing of the issues. One is knowledge. Just the sheer weight of scientific fact measured or presumably measured, which doesn't seem to be playing as important a role either because the measurement itself is controversial or we don't have it. And I think you can see that in many of the debates that the controversies that we get into. But it has to be on that basis that has to provide some sort of boundary for what that middle ground actually is, whether in terms of positive effects or negative effects. The second, very importantly, the nature of institutions that you need to define and enforce the solution. And what you suggested, which is perhaps something we need to look at in more depth, is there isn't a sort of single universal model of institution that we have here, because you're really pointing to the need for different kinds of institutions to address different kinds of problems. global versus local is one way of looking at it, and you have challenges there for cross-border, which I'm sure we'll get into in the climate change discussion. But also in terms of the opportunity or the limitations of using price or market-based mechanisms versus pure, head-banging enforcement. I mean, that's again something that varies across situations. So provides us a set of issues that we can get into.